The gavel cracked against the wooden podium like a gunshot, and every head in the cattle yard turned. Not toward the auctioneer, not toward the massive roan bull being led through the chute in a cloud of dust and bellowing fury. Every head turned toward the woman standing at the back rail who had just raised her hand and quietly, calmly, without so much as a tremor in her fingers, outbid Nathan Hudson for the third time in a single afternoon. Nathan stood 6 feet 2 inches in his worn leather boots, broad-shouldered and sun-darkened, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red rock that studded the New Mexico hillsides. He had been coming to the Cimarron cattle sales since he was 19 years old, and in 11 years of standing at that rail, nobody had outbid him on a bull he wanted. Nobody had dared. The other buyers knew better. The ranchers who drove their stock in from Taos and Mora and as far north as Trinidad, Colorado, they all understood that when Nathan Hudson fixed his eyes on a piece of livestock, it was already his. Until today. He turned slowly. The dust swirled between them in the afternoon heat, and he saw her clearly for the first time, though she had been there since morning. A woman of perhaps 27 or 28, dressed not in the impractical lace and silk that visiting buyers' wives sometimes wore, but in a practical split riding skirt of dark brown wool and a cream linen blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her hair was dark as river mud and pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, and she was watching the auctioneer confirm her bid with the kind of focus that made Nathan's jaw tighten involuntarily. She was not watching him. That was the most unsettling part. Every other buyer in that yard had stolen glances at Nathan when they edged into his territory, measuring his reaction, calculating their risk. This woman had not spared him a single look. She was there for the cattle, period. The auctioneer banged his gavel. Sold to the lady buyer for $230. Nathan heard the murmur ripple through the yard. He heard Garrett Cole, his foreman, exhale beside him like a man who had been bracing for an explosion. Nathan did not explode. He was not that kind of man. What he felt instead was something colder and more deliberate than anger, something that lived in his chest like an ember waiting for wind. He walked toward her. He had no plan. He had no speech prepared. He simply could not let her leave that yard without knowing who she was, because a woman who could look Nathan Hudson in the eye across a cattle rail and take the thing he wanted without flinching was not a woman he was willing to let walk out of his life as a stranger. She was signing the buyer's ledger when he reached her. The yard manager, a short man named Cecil Prout, was holding the book open and grinning the uncomfortable grin of a man caught between two formidable forces. Nathan stopped 2 feet from her. "That bull was going to my ranch," he said. She did not look up immediately. She finished signing her name with a steady, unhurried hand. Then she capped the pen, handed it back to Cecil, and looked up at Nathan Hudson for the very first time. Her eyes were the color of strong tea, brown and clear, and absolutely without apology. "That bull is going to mine," she said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Nathan had heard in years. He heard Garrett make a sound behind him that might have been a strangled laugh. He heard Cecil Prout shuffle sideways toward safer ground. He heard the roan bull bellow from the pen as though commenting on the situation. "I've been breeding stock in this valley for 11 years, Nathan said, keeping his voice even. "Then you have 11 years of experience picking good bulls," she replied, gathering the papers Cecil had stamped with the official sale mark. "That should make it easier to find the next one." She folded the papers, tucked them into the leather satchel she carried over one shoulder, and turned toward the gate. Nathan moved without thinking, not to stop her, just forward, just one step, and then the words came out of him in a way that surprised him more than they surprised her. "What's your name?" he asked. She paused with her hand on the gate latch, a beat. Then she turned her head just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "Rosa Boone," she said. She pushed the gate open and walked out into the blinding New Mexico sun, and Nathan Hudson stood in the cattle yard of Cimarron with dust on his boots and a name ringing in his head like a bell he could not stop. The morning of that cattle sale had started, as most significant days do, without any hint of what it would become. Nathan had ridden in from his spread, the Hudson Creek Ranch, which sat in a wide valley roughly 14 miles southeast of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1883. The ranch was successful by any reasonable measure. Nathan ran close to 800 head of longhorn cattle on land that his father, Charles Hudson, had homesteaded in 1861 and died defending in 1874, when a combination of debt, drought, and a dispute with a neighboring land company had broken the older man's heart before his body gave out. Nathan had inherited 1,200 acres of good grass and a mortgage that would have felled most men at age 22. He had not been felled. He had worked the land with a ferocity that bordered on religious devotion, and by 1883 the mortgage was paid, the herd was strong, and Nathan Hudson's name in Colfax County meant something solid. What it did not mean, to his own quiet frustration, was family. He was 30 years old and lived in the big ranch house alone except for Garrett Cole, who had his own bunkhouse quarters, and Maria Santos, the cook and housekeeper who had worked for his father before him, and who prayed loudly every Sunday for Nathan to find a wife before, as she put it, his stubbornness outlived him. He had not been looking for a wife at the Cimarron cattle sale. He had been looking for a bull. The specific bull was a roan Aberdeen Angus cross, 2 years old, 1,700 pounds of compact muscle, with the kind of broad chest and deep hip that promised exceptional calves. Nathan had heard about him from a rancher out of Springer who had bought the dam from a Texas breeder. He had ridden the 14 miles to Cimarron specifically for that bull, had inspected the animal at first light before the crowds arrived, and had settled on a top price of $215 in his mind as he walked to the sale ring. He had not counted on Rosa Boone. Rosa Boone had arrived in Cimarron 6 weeks before the cattle sale, and the town had not quite known what to make of her. She came from Santa Fe, which was unusual enough. She was unmarried, which was more unusual. And she had purchased, outright for cash, the 460 acres of the old Delgado land grant parcel that sat along the western fork of the Cimarron River, which was not unusual so much as it was breathtaking in its audacity, because the Delgado parcel had been tied up in legal disputes for 3 years, and nobody in the county had believed it would ever sell clean. Rosa had a lawyer in Santa Fe named Thomas Whitfield who had apparently spent those 3 years quietly untangling the title, and when the land was finally clear, Rosa had the money ready before the ink dried on the court order. Where the money came from was a subject of considerable speculation in Cimarron. The most common theory, proposed with various degrees of confidence by the men at the Beaumont Hotel bar, was that she had inherited it from a wealthy father or husband. The second theory, proposed mostly by the women who had met her and noticed her straight back and direct gaze, was that she had earned it herself by some means that the men were not creative enough to imagine. The truth, as Nathan would learn later, was more complicated and more interesting than either theory. Rosa Boone had grown up in the New Mexico Territory, the daughter of a Mexican mother named Consuela Reyes and an Anglo rancher named James Boone, who had owned a small spread south of Santa Fe. When Rosa was 15, her father's ranch had been swallowed by a land speculation company backed by the Santa Fe Ring, that notorious network of lawyers and politicians who manipulated land grants and territorial law to dispossess legitimate landowners throughout New Mexico. Her father had fought it legally and lost. He had fought it physically and died of a heart attack at 53, 3 years into the battle. Her mother had died the following winter of influenza. Rosa had been 18 years old, alone, with no land, no money, and a deep and specific fury at the people who had taken everything from her family. She had gone to work in Santa Fe, first as a seamstress, then as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant who recognized that she could calculate figures faster than any man he had employed. Over the following 9 years she had saved, invested cautiously in mining stock with the guidance of Thomas Whitfield, who had been her father's lawyer and remained loyal to his memory, and built up the kind of financial independence that, in 1883 New Mexico, a woman had to guard carefully because it attracted the wrong kind of attention. The Delgado parcel was her answer to everything. She was 27 years old and she was going home to the land, to the life her parents had tried to build and been denied. She was going to ranch. She was going to breed cattle, and she was not going to ask anyone's permission. The bull from the Cimarron sale, whose name she recorded in her ledger as number 1 because she was practical and not sentimental about livestock, arrived at her property 2 days after the sale, driven by one of Cecil Pruitt's hired hands. Rosa was standing at the newly repaired fence line when the animal was unloaded, and she inspected him with the same calm thoroughness she had used at the sale yard, running her hands along his back, checking his hooves, looking at his eyes. He was everything she had planned for. What she had not planned for was the rider who appeared on the ridge above her property the following morning. She saw him from the porch of the old adobe ranch house, which she was in the process of repairing with the help of 2 workers from town. He sat on a big gray horse, just at the line where the ridge broke against the sky, and he stayed there long enough that it stopped being coincidental. She shielded her eyes against the early morning light. She could not see his face at that distance, but the silhouette was familiar in some way she could not immediately name. Broad shoulders, a particular way of sitting a horse, very still, very square, like a man who had grown up on horseback and no longer thought about it. Then she recognized the horse. She had noticed it at the sale yard, a distinctive dapple gray with a white blaze. She had noticed it because she noticed horses. Nathan Hudson. She stood her ground on the porch and did not wave. After a long moment, he turned the horse and rode back over the ridge and was gone. He came back 2 days later, not on the ridge but on the road. He rode up to the gate of her property in the mid-morning, dismounted at the fence, and knocked on the post as though it were a door. Rosa was out in the near pasture checking on her small existing herd of 12 longhorn cows, which she had purchased from a rancher in Mora before the sale. She saw him at the gate and walked over, pulling off her work gloves as she came. She stopped on her side of the fence. "Mr. Hudson," she said. He looked slightly startled that she knew his name, then collected himself. "Miss Boone." He held his hat in his hands. She noticed this because a man who held his hat was a man making an effort. "I came to apologize," she waited. "I was rude to you at the sale," he said. "My manner was not what it should have been. That bull was the best animal in the lot and you had every right to bid on him. I came to say so." Rosa studied him for a moment. In the full daylight, on his own terms rather than across the charged territory of the sale yard, he was different from her initial impression, not less formidable, but less sharp at the edges. The jaw was still strong. The eyes were still that unsettling gray-green that seemed to see more than they let on, but there was something careful in how he held himself, as though he was used to people bracing for him and was making a conscious effort to give them space. "You were not exactly rude," she said. "You were surprised. There is a difference." "I was condescending," he said flatly. "I implied that because I have been buying cattle in this county longer than you, I had a prior claim to what I wanted. That is not how an auction works." She almost smiled. "Not quite. No, it is not." He looked down at his hat for a moment. "How is he settling in?" Despite herself, she was pleased by the question. A man who asked about the animal's transition was a man who understood cattle. "Well enough," she said. "He was nervous for the first day. He is calmer now. Good roan bulls usually are. They take time to read a new place." He paused. "You have a good piece of land here. The West Fork runs clean water most of the year." "I know," she said. "That is why I bought it." He nodded slowly. There was a silence that was not exactly uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence between 2 people who are both accustomed to saying exactly what they mean and nothing more. "I have a proposition," he said. "A business one." She raised an eyebrow. "I run 800 head east of here. I have good grass, but my breeding stock has been getting thin. That bull of yours, he is exactly what my herd needs." He met her eyes steadily. I would like to discuss a stud arrangement. Seasonal, fair market terms, nothing unreasonable. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. The proposition was legitimate. She had already been thinking about exactly this, because a stud arrangement with an established neighboring ranch would generate income while her own herd built up. And Hudson Creek Ranch was, by any account, the most productive operation in the county. The trouble was that Nathan Hudson had known this when he walked up to her gate, and they both understood it. "You could have sent a letter," she said. "I could have," he agreed. Another silence. The roan bull bellowed from the near pasture, and both of them turned instinctively to look. Rosa turned back first. "I will think about it," she said. "Come back Thursday and I will give you my answer." He nodded, put his hat back on his head, and mounted his horse with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He looked down at her from the saddle. "Thank you for your time, Miss Boone," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Hudson," she replied. She watched him ride away down the road until the dust settled, and then she stood at the fence for a moment longer with her work gloves in her hand and an unfamiliar feeling in her chest that she did not immediately examine. Thursday came, and she gave him her answer, which was yes, but with conditions she had written out in clear and specific terms on 2 sheets of paper, one copy for him and one for her own records. The stud fee was fair but not cheap. The schedule was practical. The record-keeping requirements were thorough. Nathan read through both copies carefully at her kitchen table, the first time he had been inside the adobe house, while she poured coffee from the pot on the stove. He looked up at the end. "You drew these terms up yourself." "I did. They are better than what my lawyer would have written." "Your lawyer would have been working for you," she said. "I was working for both of us. Fair terms hold longer than favorable ones." He looked at her over the paper for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite the careful neutrality he had been carrying since the gate that first day. It passed quickly. He picked up the pen she had set out. "Where do I sign?" he said. The stud arrangement brought Nathan Hudson to her property twice a month through the autumn of 1883, and those visits established a rhythm that neither of them had anticipated. He was always professional. The visits were always about the cattle. He would inspect the bull, discuss the breeding records with her, occasionally offer an observation about the land or the herd that was useful without being presumptuous. But the visits grew longer. Slowly, the way a river changes course, not in a moment but across many small shifts. October came with its cold nights and brilliantly clear days, and one afternoon they found themselves walking the fence line along the river together, discussing a section of post-rot that needed attention before winter, and Rosa realized they had been talking for 2 hours, and she was not the least bit tired of it. That was unusual for her. She was generally tired of most conversations within 40 minutes. Nathan talked about cattle and land with the precision of a man who loved what he did, not in a boastful way, but in the way a craftsman talks about his work, full of specific detail and genuine enthusiasm. He talked about the geology of the valley, which he had read about in books borrowed from the Territorial Library in Santa Fe. He talked about the Cimarron River's patterns and what they told you about drought cycles if you knew how to read them. And he listened when she talked. That was the thing she noticed most, and the thing that unsettled her most, because she was not accustomed to being listened to. He did not wait for gaps in her sentences so he could insert his own thoughts. He actually listened, and then he responded to what she had actually said, which was such a specific and uncommon experience that the first time it happened, Rosa had to pause in what she was saying because the novelty of it temporarily disrupted her train of thought. He noticed. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. "The opposite." And then she did not explain further, and he did not press, and they walked on along the fence. By November, the visits had expanded to include coffee afterward, sitting on the porch of the adobe in the fading afternoon light if the weather permitted, or at the kitchen table if it did not. They talked about everything. The territorial politics, which both of them distrusted with specific and well-reasoned arguments. The land grant disputes, which made Rosa's voice go quiet and careful in a way Nathan noticed, but did not push until she was ready. The cattle markets in Kansas City, and what the coming of the railroad through New Mexico would mean for ranchers in the territory. He told her about his father. Not all at once, but in pieces, the way you release something heavy when you have been carrying it for a long time and the ground beneath you finally feels solid enough to set it down. Charles Hudson had been a stubborn man, brilliant with cattle, hopeless with money, and Nathan had loved him with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion of a son who respects his father even when he can see his father's flaws clearly. Watching the ranch nearly go under had been the formative crisis of Nathan's life, and the decade of work to save it had shaped him into something harder and more guarded than he might otherwise have been. Rosa told him about her parents. This took longer, because the story was wound through with grief and anger that she had not fully set down, and she was careful with it the way you are careful with something that still has the capacity to hurt you if you hold it wrong. When she told him about the Santa Fe ring and what had been done to her family, Nathan's jaw tightened in a way she recognized. "I know about the ring," he said quietly. "They came after 3 ranchers east of me in 1878 and 1879. One of them, Harlan Voss, lost everything. The other 2 paid what amounted to extortion and kept their land. I went to the county seat and testified for Harlan in court." He paused. "It did not help." "It rarely does," Rosa said. "No," he said, "but I would do it again." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because the alternative is letting them win without a fight," he said, "and I cannot do that. It is not in me." She understood this completely. It was not in her either. The moment between them held still. There in the kitchen with the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and the sound of wind under the eaves. And Rosa was very suddenly aware that what had been building between them over these weeks of careful, practical, professional interaction was not actually careful or practical at all. It was the most reckless thing she had ever been involved in, because she had come to this land to build something that was hers, that could not be taken, and she had not budgeted for the possibility that her carefully constructed independence might find itself seriously challenged by a 30-year-old rancher with gray-green eyes who listened when she talked. She stood up and went to refill the coffee cups, and when she turned back he was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, though she had become reasonably fluent in Nathan Hudson's expressions over the past 2 months. "I should head back before dark," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He stood up, reached for his coat and hat on the hook by the door. At the door he paused with his hand on the frame, not turning around. "Rosa," he said. It was the first time he had used her first name without a formal address. "Yes," she said again, not committing to anything. "I am glad you outbid me," he said. He said it to the door frame and then he went through it, and she heard his boots on the porch steps and then the sound of his horse on the frozen ground. She sat back down at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and told herself very firmly that she was not going to be foolish about this. She was, of course, already being foolish about this. She just had not admitted it yet. December in the Cimarron Valley was cold and sharp and brilliant, with frost on the grass before dawn and afternoons that still held enough sun to make the river flash silver through the bare cottonwoods. Rosa spent the month in the hard, practical work of winter preparation, checking feed stores, repairing the barn roof with help from a carpenter from town, making sure her small herd was sheltered and fed, and the bull was comfortable in his separate pen. Nathan sent word in early December that the stud visits would pause until spring, which was logical given the cattle cycle, and she was annoyed with herself for the way her stomach dropped when she read the note that Garrett Cole delivered. She wrote back a brief, professional acknowledgement. She was perfectly fine. She had plenty of work. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, there was a knock at her door on a Tuesday afternoon when she was not expecting anyone. She opened it to find Nathan standing on her porch with a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm and a look on his face that suggested he had argued with himself about coming and lost. "I was in town," he said. "I see," she said. He held out the parcel. "I found this at the general store. Felt like something you might use." She took it. It was heavier than she expected. She unwrapped it to find a copy of a book on cattle breeding and genetics, published in 1881 by an agricultural college in Ohio, which was exactly the kind of technical manual she had been trying to locate for months. She looked up at him. "Thomas at the general store sometimes gets books in from the catalog," Nathan said, studying a point somewhere past her left shoulder. "I asked him to look for that one a while back. I already have a copy." "This cost you money," she said. "It is a gift," he said. "If you do not want it, I can take it back." "I want it," she said. She held it against her chest with both hands for a moment, which was not a thing she would have done if she had been thinking about what she was doing. "Would you like to come in?" He would. He did. Maria Santos, who had come over from Hudson Creek to help Rosa put up preserved vegetables for the winter, emerged from the back of the house, took one look at the situation, and found a reason to be thoroughly occupied elsewhere for the rest of the afternoon. They sat by the fire and talked about the book and then about other things, and at some point the conversation became something Rosa could not have accurately transcribed afterward, because she was less focused on the content of what was being said and more focused on the specific quality of being in the same room as Nathan Hudson in the firelight in December. He had a small scar on the left side of his jaw. She had never been close enough to notice it before. She did not ask about it. He left at dusk, and at the door he turned and looked at her with that expression she was getting better at reading, and what she read in it was something that matched what was happening in her own chest with unsettling precision. "Merry Christmas, Rosa," he said. "Merry Christmas, Nathan," she said. He smiled. It was not a small smile or a polite smile. It was the real one, the one she had been catching glimpses of for months, and it transformed his face completely, made him look younger and less guarded and so startlingly warm that she held onto the door frame to keep her footing. Then he was gone, and she stood in the doorway and watched the dusk close over the valley and thought about the several thousand very good reasons why she should be careful. The most pressing of the reasons was one she had not told Nathan yet. His name was Everett Crane, and he was the reason Rosa had left Santa Fe. Everett Crane was 41 years old, a partner in a land speculation firm with connections to the Santa Fe ring, and he had been pursuing Rosa for 2 years before her departure. Pursuing was perhaps too mild a word for what Everett did. He was accustomed to acquiring things, land, business interests, women, and he had decided that Rosa Boone, with her intelligence and her growing financial independence, was an acquisition worth making. He had proposed twice, been refused twice, and had responded to the second refusal with a campaign of pressure that ranged from unwanted visits to her workplace to a quiet, deliberate attempt to undermine her credit arrangements with the Santa Fe merchants who supplied her bookkeeping clients. When Thomas Whitfield had presented her with the opportunity to acquire the Delgado parcel and relocate to Cimarron, Rosa had seen it as an escape from Everett's reach as much as a fulfillment of her own dreams. She had told no one in Cimarron about him. He had no legal claim on her. He was simply a man who had decided she belonged to him, and that kind of man was more dangerous than one with an actual grievance, because there was nothing specific to address or negotiate. She had been watching for signs of him for 6 months and had seen none. She had begun to allow herself to believe that the distance was sufficient, that the relative obscurity of Cimarron, New Mexico territory, was enough to discourage a man like Everett Crane, who preferred the comfortable architecture of city power to the dust and difficulty of the open country. She had been wrong. On the 14th of January, 1884, Thomas Whitfield sent her a letter by express post. Everett Crane had been making inquiries in Santa Fe about the Delgado land purchase. He knew she was in Cimarron. He had, according to Thomas's source, spoken to a solicitor about potential legal challenges to the land title. Rosa read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the locked drawer of her desk. She was not afraid. She was very specifically and deliberately angry, which was different from afraid and considerably more useful. But she was also alone in a way she had not quite reckoned with. She had her lawyer in Santa Fe, she had her own resources, and she had spent 9 years building the kind of competence and self-sufficiency that did not bend easily under pressure. What she did not have was anyone in Cimarron who knew the full shape of the threat she was facing. She thought about Nathan for 3 days before she made a decision. She did not make the decision because she needed him. She made it because she had decided, in those 3 days, that the situation required information sharing between people whose interests were aligned, and Nathan Hudson's interest in the stability and legal security of land ownership in Cimarron County was demonstrably aligned with hers. She told herself this very clearly. She also told herself that the way she had thought about him every day for the past 6 weeks had absolutely nothing to do with the decision. She sent Garrett Cole, who had stopped by to check on one of the cows she was monitoring, back to Hudson Creek with a message asking Nathan to come when he had time. He came the next morning. She told him everything. About Everett Crane, about Santa Fe, about the harassment and the proposals and the reason she had moved so decisively to Cimarron. She told it plainly and without self-pity, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with the letter from Thomas Whitfield and her own notes laid out between them. Nathan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What kind of legal challenge can he bring against the title?" It was exactly the right question. She loved him a little for asking it first, before the outrage or the protective instinct or anything else. "Thomas believes the challenge would be frivolous," she said. "The title is clean." But a frivolous challenge still costs money to defend and creates uncertainty in the county records, which can affect my ability to secure credit for expansion. "And he knows that," Nathan said. "He is very good at this particular kind of pressure," she said. Nathan folded his hands on the table. He had carpenter's hands, which was a thought that had no place in this conversation, and yet she had it anyway. "I know 2 members of the County Land Commission," he said. "If there is a challenge filed, I can speak to them. Not improperly," he added quickly. "Simply as someone who can attest to the legitimate nature of your purchase and your operation. That would be helpful," she said. "I will also write to my lawyer in Santa Fe and have him put Thomas Whitfield in contact. They should compare what they know." He paused. "Is there any possibility this man would come here himself?" "There is always a possibility," she said. "He is the kind of man who believes that physical presence exerts its own persuasion." Nathan's expression shifted in a way she had learned to recognize, the tightening around the eyes that meant he was feeling something he was not going to express in a disruptive way. "If he comes to Cimarron," he said carefully, "I want to know." "Why?" she asked. She was not testing him. She genuinely wanted to understand what he meant. He met her eyes. "Because you should not have to face that alone if there is someone willing to stand with you," he said. "And I am willing." It was not a declaration of any kind that she could point to. He had not said anything that could not be interpreted as the concern of a neighbor and business partner. But the way he said it, with that particular quietness that was his version of intensity, made the distinction irrelevant. "Thank you, Nathan," she said. He nodded. He looked at the papers on the table and then back at her. "You are not frightened of him." "No," she said, "but you are not comfortable either." "I am angry," she said. "There is a difference." Something crossed his face that she could not quite catch before it was gone. "Yes," he said. "There is." January moved into February. The letters between Thomas Whitfield and Nathan's lawyer in Santa Fe established a clear picture of Everett Crane's activities. He had indeed engaged a solicitor to review the Delgado title, but the solicitor had apparently advised him that the case was without merit because no challenge was filed with the territorial court. Rosa monitored the situation through Thomas and went about her work with the steady determination that characterized everything she did. February brought snow and, unexpectedly, warmth of a different kind. The blizzard that swept down from Colorado on the 8th of February shut the valley in for 4 days. Rosa had been prepared. Her herd was sheltered and she had sufficient feed, but the snow came faster than anticipated, and by the afternoon of the first day, the road between her property and town was impassable. She was not concerned about herself. She was concerned about the section of the barn roof she had been meaning to shore up before the heaviest snow came and had not quite gotten to. On the second day of the blizzard, she heard hoofbeats. She looked out to find Nathan on his gray horse, which was a testament to what that animal was made of given the conditions, coming up her lane with a bedroll behind the saddle and a look of entirely unconvincing casualness. She opened the door. "What are you doing?" she called over the wind. "I need to check the bull," he called back. "And then I noticed your south barn corner looks like it is taking on weight." It was, in fact, doing exactly that. The snow accumulation on the low corner of the roof was creating a dangerous downward pressure on the old timbers, and left another day it might give way and endanger the animals sheltered inside. She did not argue with him. They spent 3 hours in the barn together in the gray February light, working side by side to relieve the snow load and reinforce the failing corner with timbers she had in the supply shed. The work was cold and physical and required genuine coordination, and at some point during the 3rd hour Rosa looked up to find Nathan watching her, just for a moment, with an expression so unguarded that she felt it go through her like heat. He looked away immediately. She pretended she had not seen it. That evening, because the storm was not abating and the road was still impassable, and there was nothing sensible to do but wait it out, they ate dinner at her kitchen table. She had made a venison stew from what she had laid in for winter, and Nathan contributed a jar of preserved peaches from the saddlebag he had brought, which he had the grace to be slightly embarrassed about when she noted it. "Maria packed them," he said. "She worries." "About you or about me?" Rosa asked. He looked at his bowl. "Probably both," he admitted. After dinner they sat by the fire, and Rosa got out the cattle breeding book he had given her for Christmas, and asked him about a specific chapter on selection criteria for hybrid breeds, and they talked about it with the kind of engaged, detailed focus that they had both discovered was one of the pleasures of each other's company. And at some point the fire burned low and neither of them moved to add wood, and the room got quieter. And Rosa became very aware of the particular quality of the silence between them. Nathan set down his copy of the notes he had been reading from and looked at the fire. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart, which she had been pretending was behaving normally, did something she chose not to acknowledge. "All right," she said. "I have been trying to be appropriate," he said. "About this, about," he gestured slightly, "what has happened between us. Because you came here to build something of your own and I did not want to be something that complicated that." She was very still. "But I think I am complicating it regardless," he said, "whether I say anything or not. Because I am not very good at pretending something is not true when it is." He finally looked at her. "And what is true is that I have thought about very little other than you for the better part of 4 months, and I believe you know that. And I believe you are being careful about it for your own good reasons, and I am not asking you to be less careful. I am only saying that I am here. That is all. Just that I am here and I am not going anywhere." Rosa looked at him for a long time. "You rode through a blizzard with preserved peaches," she said finally. The corner of his mouth moved. "I did." "That is fairly difficult to misinterpret," she said. "I was hoping not," he said. She set down her book. "I came here to have something that was entirely mine," she said. "Something no one could take. My mother and father lost everything because they trusted in a life they had built and it was taken from them. I have spent 9 years making sure that could not happen to me again." She met his eyes. "The thought of wanting something I could not control the outcome of is the most frightening thing I can imagine." "I know," he said quietly. "You could not promise me any particular outcome," she said. "No," he agreed. "I could not. Nobody can." "And yet," she said. "And yet," he said. She let out a slow breath. "I am not good at being careful about this either," she said. "I thought I was wrong." He reached across the space between them and very carefully, very slowly, took her hand where it lay on the arm of the chair. He did not do anything else, just held her hand with both of his and looked at her. "I know about the dark parts," he said. "I know about Crane and the land and what was done to your family. I know you are not someone who needs rescuing. I'm not trying to rescue you." He turned her hand over slightly, just the smallest movement. "I want to know you. Whatever that means going forward, whatever pace is right for you." Rosa looked down at their hands. Then she turned her hand and held his back. "Stay until the storm passes," she said. He stayed 3 days. Maria Santos, when she heard about it later, lit a candle in gratitude to 3 separate saints. He slept in the spare room. Nothing happened that Rosa could not have reported in detail to any member of Cimarron society without embarrassment. But something shifted in those 3 days that was more significant than what did not happen. They were easy with each other in a new way, the careful professional distance entirely set aside, replaced by something warmer and more honest. They cooked together, which involved Nathan burning the biscuits and Rosa laughing at him, which was the first time she had laughed out loud in his company, and which caused him to stop completely and look at her with an expression that made her stop laughing and look back. They talked more in those 3 days than in the previous 4 months combined, because the storm had lifted the usual constraints, and there was nothing to do but exist in the same space and be real with each other. They talked about what they wanted, not just for their ranches but in a broader sense. Nathan had never told anyone that he sometimes walked the ridge above his property in the evenings and felt the loneliness of it like an actual weight. Rosa had never told anyone that the day she had signed the papers on the Delgado property, she had sat in the lawyer's office in Santa Fe and cried, not from happiness exactly, but from the release of 9 years of work and determination finally reaching solid ground. They told each other these things by the fire with the blizzard pressing against the windows, and something was built in those 3 days that Rosa knew, even as it was happening, was not going to be undone. When the storm cleared on the 11th of February and the road became passable and Nathan prepared to ride back to Hudson Creek, he stood at the gate as she stood on her side of it, which was a reversal of their first meeting, and he looked at her with the full force of everything he was, which was considerable. "May I call on you?" he asked. "Properly, not about the bull." "You may," she said. He smiled, the real one again, the one that transformed his face. "Sunday." "Sunday," she agreed. He mounted the gray horse and looked down at her one more time. "Rosa," he said. "Nathan," she said. He rode away through the bright post-blizzard morning with the snow sparkling like cut glass in every direction, and Rosa stood at her gate and did not try to examine or categorize what she felt. She just let it be what it was. March came with mud and the first green along the river, and with it came Everett Crane. He arrived in Cimarron on a Tuesday, traveling in a hired coach from the rail terminus at Raton, which told you something about what kind of man he was, because a man with any feel for the land arrives on horseback. He checked into the Beaumont Hotel, engaged a room for a week, and spent the first 2 days establishing himself in the social landscape of the town, which he did with a smooth facility that Rosa recognized from his Santa Fe incarnation. She heard he was in town on the Wednesday, from the general store owner's wife, who mentioned it with the slightly excited air of someone who had information they know to be significant. Rosa thanked her and went home and sat at her desk for 30 minutes thinking clearly and without panic. Then she wrote a letter to Thomas Whitfield, informing him that Crane had arrived and requesting any additional legal information that might be useful. She wrote a second letter to the county land commissioner establishing a formal record of her title documentation, and then she wrote a short note to Nathan. He came the same afternoon. She told him Crane was in Cimarron. Nathan's face went through several things in quick succession, none of them comfortable, and he settled on a kind of controlled alertness that she associated with a man who had spent years being the one responsible for things. "Has he contacted you?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "He will. This is how he operates. He establishes himself somewhere first, creates the impression of permanence and social connection, and then makes contact from a position of apparent strength." "He sounds like a man who has practiced this," Nathan said. "With his business interests, yes," Rosa said. The method works when people are not paying attention to what he is doing. And you are paying attention. I have been paying attention to Everett Crane for 2 years, she said. I know exactly how he thinks. Nathan stood at the window looking out at the road. Rosa watched the tension in his shoulders. Nathan, she said. He turned. I need you to let me handle this, she said. Not because I do not trust you. Because if you insert yourself directly and Crane perceives it as territorial, it will escalate in ways that become harder to manage. The most useful thing you can do is exactly what you have already done, the documentation, the connections with the Land Commission. Let me be the one who faces him. I know how to do it. He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see the conflict in it, the instinct to put himself between her and the threat warring with his understanding of who she was and what she was asking. All right, he said, but I want to know everything as it happens. You will, she said. Crane appeared at her property on Thursday afternoon, riding out from town in a hired buggy. Rosa was in the yard and met him at the gate, which she did not open. Everett Crane at 41 was a handsome man in the way that expensive things can look handsome when they are well maintained. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a suit that had been made in an actual city, and the particular smile of a man who has learned that smiling is a useful disguise. Rosa, he said, as though they were friends, you have done well for yourself. Mr. Crane, she said, state your business. His smile adjusted slightly. I have come a long way to see you. And you have seen me, she said. Now state your business. He studied her, assessing. I want to discuss the Delgado title, he said. My legal advisors have identified certain irregularities in the original grant documentation that I believe merit examination. Your legal advisors advised you 2 months ago that the title was clean, she said, as recorded by the territorial court, as confirmed by the county land commissioner's office. There are no irregularities. His eyes sharpened slightly. She had known things he did not expect her to know, and he was recalibrating. You have been thorough, he said. I am always thorough, she said. This does not have to be adversarial, Rosa, he said, shifting register smoothly. I came because I am concerned about you. A woman alone in this territory with this much property, these are significant responsibilities and there are significant risks. I am managing the responsibilities and the risks quite capably, she said. Thank you for your concern. I could help, he said. We could come to an arrangement that would benefit us both. We have nothing to arrange, she said. My land is not for sale, and neither am I. I refused you in Santa Fe, and I am refusing you now. The distance between those 2 refusals is 9 months and approximately 200 miles, and it has not changed my answer. Crane's expression went through something that was not quite anger but was related to it, the flash of a man unaccustomed to being denied. Then the smooth surface closed back over it. You are making a mistake, he said pleasantly. I am not, she said. Good afternoon, Mr. Crane. He held her gaze for a moment, measuring. Then he touched his hat brim with a kind of mock courtesy and turned the buggy back toward town. Rosa stood at her gate until the buggy was out of sight, and then she breathed out slowly and allowed herself to feel, just for a moment, the weight of everything she was carrying. Then she squared her shoulders and went inside to write the account of the conversation for Thomas Whitfield's records. Nathan came that evening without being summoned. She told him everything, including Crane's implied threat. Nathan listened without speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He referenced the grant documentation, he said. He has not given up on the legal angle, he has just retreated temporarily. Yes, she said. I expect he will file something within 30 days. Something designed to create delay and uncertainty, not something he expects to win. Then we prepare for that, Nathan said. We, she said. She did not mean it as a correction. It was something else. He looked at her. Yes, he said. We, she nodded slowly. They sat together in the kitchen while the early March night pressed against the windows, and they planned. Nathan would speak with both members of the Land Commission the following day and formally request that any challenge to the Delgado title receive expedited review given the prior court confirmation. Rosa would have Thomas Whitfield prepare a comprehensive response brief that could be filed immediately upon any challenge being submitted. The county sheriff, a man named Tom Braddock whom Nathan had known for 8 years, would be quietly informed of Crane's history and his presence in town. It was systematic and thorough and exactly the right approach, and Rosa felt the peculiar comfort of being genuinely partnered with someone for the first time in her adult life. It was different from needing someone. She had not needed anyone to build what she had built, but this was different from needing. This was choosing, with her full intelligence and all the information available to her, to not be alone in something because the alternative was not better. It was simply lonelier. Crane filed a challenge to the Delgado title on the 22nd of March, exactly as anticipated. Thomas Whitfield's response brief was filed the following day, which Rosa knew would infuriate Crane because it demonstrated that she had been ahead of him at every step. The Land Commission, having been briefed by Nathan, treated the challenge as what it was and scheduled an expedited review hearing for the middle of April. In the meantime, Crane remained in Cimarron, and his remaining there was itself a form of pressure, as Rosa well understood. He appeared at social events. He charmed the hotel proprietor and the town's more prominent citizens with his city polish, and he made sure that his presence was visible and comfortable and permanent-seeming. But Rosa had been in Cimarron for 8 months by this point. She had her own standing in the community, built the slow and solid way by being honest in her dealings and competent in her work, and showing up for her neighbors when they needed help. She was not starting from zero against Crane's charm offensive. She was meeting it from established ground, and she was not, as it turned out, meeting it alone. Nathan went about his business in Cimarron and the surrounding county with the same directness he always had, which meant that when the subject of Everett Crane's challenge came up in the natural course of conversation at the general store, or the blacksmith, or the Beaumont bar, Nathan's assessment of the situation was brief, clear, and unambiguous. He did not speak against Crane. He simply spoke for Rosa, for the legitimacy of her purchase, for the quality of her operation, for the settled and decided nature of the land title. He said these things to men who respected him, and the things were true, and the effect was that Crane's implied narrative about irregularities and concerns found no sympathetic audience. Crane noticed. Rosa knew he would. On the 1st of April, Crane appeared at her gate for the second time, and this time his manner was less smooth. "You have had help," he said. "I have good neighbors," she said. "Hudson," he said flatly. She did not answer. "He cannot protect you legally," Crane said. "Whatever he says to whoever in this county, the territorial court operates on law, not on a rancher's recommendation." "My legal case operates on law," she said. "It is a very good legal case." "The recommendation is a courtesy." He studied her. "Why are you fighting this?" he said, and for just a moment there was something genuinely frustrated under the smooth surface, something that was almost human. "I would have given you everything. In Santa Fe I offered you everything." "You offered me a cage with a comfortable interior," she said. "I wanted a life. There is a difference." He went still. Then the smooth surface locked back into place. "The hearing will not go as you expect," he said. "I expect it to go exactly as the law and the evidence dictate," she said. "Goodbye, Mr. Crane." He left. She went inside and she sat down at her desk, and she was not afraid. But her hands shook slightly for a moment before they stilled, and she acknowledged that to herself honestly, because she had learned that pretending not to feel things was a luxury she could not afford. That evening Nathan came, because it was Sunday, and he had been coming on Sundays since February. He brought flowers from somewhere, which was startling, rough-cut wildflowers that were just beginning along the creek, purple and yellow and white, held in one large hand with the slightly self-conscious air of a man who had made a gesture and was committed to it now. She took the flowers. She found a jar for them. She set them on the table and sat down across from him, and he looked at her with the directness that she had come to love about him. "Crane came again," he said. "It was not a question." "This morning," she said. He waited. He is running out of options, she said. The desperation is starting to show. That makes him less effective but potentially less predictable. What do you need? He asked. She looked at the flowers on the table, then she looked at him. I need the hearing to go well, she said. And I need things to keep being what they are. What they are, he said carefully. Between us, she said, I need that to keep being what it is. Because it is the most solid thing I have right now that does not have a legal challenge attached to it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand the way he had done by the fire in February with both of his, and he held it. Rosa, he said, I love you. He said it the way he said everything, simply and without decoration, with the full weight of a man who means what he says and has thought carefully before saying it. She felt the words go through her like sunlight, which was not a metaphor she would have chosen, but it was the accurate one. I love you too, she said. That is also terrifying. I know, he said. I'm not done being terrified, she said. I know that too, he said. It is all right. She turned her hand and held his. It is all right, she agreed. The Land Commission hearing on the 16th of April was held in the county courthouse, a sturdy adobe building on the main street of Cimarron that had served the county's legal needs since 1872. Rosa arrived with Thomas Whitfield, who had come from Santa Fe for the occasion. Nathan was in the gallery, not as a participant, simply present, which Rosa had asked him about beforehand. You do not have to come, she had said. I know, he had said, but you are coming anyway. Yes, he had said. Is that all right? It was more than all right. It was everything. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Crane's solicitor presented the challenge with considerable skill, citing ambiguities in the original Spanish land grant documentation from which the Delgado parcel derived its legitimacy. Thomas Whitfield dismantled the arguments point by point with a thoroughness that made Rosa proud of the decade of loyalty and competence he had given to her family. The land commissioners asked precise questions and took careful notes. At the end of the 4 hours, the senior commissioner announced that the challenge was without sufficient merit to proceed and dismissed it formally and on the record. Crane, sitting across the room in an excellent suit with his hands folded on the table, showed nothing. He was very good at showing nothing when it mattered. Rosa showed nothing either. She thanked Thomas, shook hands with both commissioners, and gathered her papers with steady hands. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Nathan was waiting. When she came through the door and he saw her face, he crossed the corridor in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, and she let him, which was a thing she would not have let anyone do 3 months ago. She stood there with her face against the rough wool of his coat and felt the whole long tension of the past week's release in one long, quiet exhale. It's over, he said against her hair. It is over, she confirmed. He held her for another moment. Then Thomas Whitfield appeared behind them and made a dignified pretense of needing to consult his papers, and Rosa stepped back from Nathan's arms with what she hoped was composure. Nathan shook Thomas's hand. Good work, he said. Miss Boone's preparation was the foundation, Thomas said, which was genuinely true. He gave Rosa a look over his spectacles that managed to convey both professional satisfaction and personal warmth. Your father would have been proud today. Rosa swallowed. Thank you, Thomas, she said. Crane left Cimarron 2 days later. He did not speak to Rosa again before he left, which she had not expected and was somewhat grateful for, because she had prepared a complete and well-considered farewell, and it would have been wasted. He was gone, and the land was hers, and it was April in the Cimarron Valley, with the cottonwoods leafing out in pale gold, and the river running full with snowmelt, and the grass so green it looked painted. She stood on the ridge above her property one afternoon in late April, and looked at it all spread below her. The adobe house with the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, the barn with the repaired corner, the pasture where the longhorn cows were beginning to show heavy with spring calves, and the roan bull standing with considerable self-satisfaction in his separate pen. And she felt the feeling she had cried over in Thomas Whitfield's office the day she had signed the papers, but this time without the crying. This time it was pure and uncomplicated and full. She heard hoofbeats on the road below and looked down to see Nathan on the gray horse, coming up her lane at an easy canter. He looked up and saw her on the ridge and raised his hand. She raised hers back. He tied the horse at the fence and climbed the ridge to where she stood, because he knew the terrain of her property as well as she did by this point. He came and stood beside her and looked at the valley. "It is a good piece of land," he said. "It is," she agreed. They stood together in the afternoon sun for a while. The valley was very quiet in the way that New Mexico in spring is quiet, full of sound and space, and the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the red bluffs to the north. "I have been thinking," Nathan said. "That can go several ways," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I have been thinking about the property line between your west pasture and my north section," he said. She looked at him. "What about it?" "It is technically two separate properties," he said, "but the grass runs together across it. The water from the fork feeds both sides. Ecologically speaking, they function as one piece of land." She was quiet. She understood where this was going, and she was letting it go there. "I have also been thinking," he said, "that my house is too large for one person and your house is too small for winter, and that I have been in love with you since at least November and probably before." "Probably before," she agreed. He turned to look at her. "Rosa," he said. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I have not asked the question yet." "You were about to," she said, "and I was answering." He looked at her for a moment with that expression that still had the capacity to undo her completely, the one full of warmth and wonder and the particular quality of a man who has been given something he was not entirely sure he deserved and intends to prove worthy of it. "Yes," he said. "All right." He reached out and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair back from her face very gently. "Will you marry me, Rosa Boone?" "Yes, Nathan Hudson," she said. "I will." He kissed her on the ridge above the Delgado parcel in the April sunshine, with the hawk still circling above the red bluffs and the roan bull bellowing in his pen below as though he had an opinion about developments. And it was nothing like what either of them had expected their lives to look like, which made it exactly right. They were married in June of 1884. The ceremony was held outdoors on the grounds of Rosa's property, because she had insisted on it and Nathan had not argued, understanding that the land was where this had begun, and it was appropriate that it be where this was formally declared. The minister from the Cimarron church performed the service, and Maria Santos prepared enough food for twice the number of guests, and then complained happily about the surplus for weeks afterward. Thomas Whitfield came from Santa Fe, which he said he would not have missed for any consideration. Garrett Cole, who had the sentimental heart of a very large dog, cried during the vows and denied it afterward with considerable energy. Cecil Prout, the yard manager from the cattle sale, attended and made a toast that referenced the roan bull in a way that made everyone laugh and made Rosa and Nathan look at each other across the crowd, with the kind of private understanding that is one of the better things about loving someone. The question of the two properties was resolved in the way Nathan had suggested on the ridge, not by Rosa folding her land into his, but by a formal partnership that recognized both operations as distinct and both principles as equal, which was Nathan's idea, and which Rosa accepted because it was the right structure, and because the man who had proposed it understood why it needed to be that way. They moved into the Hudson Creek Ranch house, which was indeed larger, and Rosa immediately set about making it habitable in ways it had not previously been, adding books and a proper desk in the room that became her office and persuading Nathan to let her plant a kitchen garden along the south side of the house, which he agreed to, and then became genuinely invested in to her considerable amusement. The adobe house on the Delgado parcel became the home of Garrett Cole, who had been living in the bunkhouse for 11 years and received the upgrade with a dignity that was somewhat undermined by the fact that he stood in the doorway of his new residence and could not speak for several minutes. The summer of 1884 was everything a New Mexico summer can be, brutal and beautiful in equal measure, with thunderstorms that turned the arroyos white with rushing water, and then gave way to evenings of such extraordinary stillness and color that standing on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset felt like witnessing something sacred. Rosa expanded her herd with calves from the spring breeding season, and the roan bull proved himself to be exactly as excellent as she had known he would be. Nathan's herd showed the improvement by autumn that his calculations had predicted, the hybrid calves heavier at weaning and stronger through the shoulders. They worked side by side and separately, each with their own domain and each genuinely interested in the others. Nathan could tell Rosa things about the northern range that she had not yet learned from reading, and she could tell him things about genetics and selection criteria that he had been operating on instinct rather than principle. And the combination of his experience and her systematic thinking produced results that other ranchers in the county began to notice and inquire about. In the autumn of 1884, Rosa discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Nathan on a Tuesday evening, because waiting until a more dramatic moment seemed like the wrong approach for two people who had always been direct with each other. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts when she came and sat across from him and told him. He put the accounts down very carefully. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am entirely all right," she said. "I am well and I am glad." He came around the table and crouched down in front of her chair, which brought him to her eye level, and he took both of her hands and held them and looked at her with an expression that she stored carefully in the part of her memory she reserved for the most important things. "I am glad too," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "I know," she said. He pressed his forehead briefly against her hands just for a moment and then looked up at her. "What do you need?" "Nothing different," she said. "I am going to keep working." "Of course," he said. He had known her long enough to know that suggesting otherwise would be unnecessary and futile. "Although," she said, "if you wanted to take over the task of repairing the east fence section, I would not object." "Done," he said immediately. She smiled. He smiled back. He stayed crouching in front of her chair for another moment, her hands in his, and the ranch house was warm and the accounts were forgotten, and outside the October night was full of stars. Maria Santos, informed the following morning, made an extremely undignified sound of triumph and immediately began planning food. Thomas Whitfield sent a letter of congratulations that was warm and formal in equal measure. Garrett Cole nodded with great seriousness and said that was good news, and then went and told every person he encountered for the next 3 days. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was hard, as winters in New Mexico territory can be, but the ranch was prepared. They had good feed stored, the cattle were sheltered, and the house was warm. Rosa and Nathan settled into the particular intimacy of a long winter spent in close quarters, which deepened everything between them that the busy working seasons had sometimes left at the surface. They read together in the evenings, sitting on either side of the fire, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other. Nathan had acquired, at Rosa's suggestion, a collection of books on ranching science and land management that had expanded his already considerable knowledge. Rosa had found, in a box of her mother's things that Thomas had kept in storage in Santa Fe and sent up that autumn, a collection of Mexican folk songs that her mother had sung, and she sometimes sang them in the kitchen in the mornings when she did not know Nathan was listening from the hallway. He told her one evening that he liked hearing her sing. She was mortified for approximately 30 seconds, and then decided that she did not care. She was not going to be self-conscious in her own home about singing in her own kitchen, and also she knew perfectly well that she had a reasonable voice, which her mother had told her repeatedly, and which she had no reason to disbelieve. She sang more openly after that. Nathan listened without making a production of it, which was exactly right. Their son was born on the 22nd of March, 1885, which was, as Garrett Cole pointed out with great satisfaction, exactly 1 day after the spring equinox, as though he had been waiting for the precise right moment. The birth was attended by the doctor from Cimarron, who had made the 14-mile trip in excellent time once the message reached him, and by Maria Santos, who had delivered more babies than the doctor and was considerably calmer about the process. Nathan was in the house throughout, which the doctor considered unusual and Maria considered correct. He sat outside the bedroom door during the actual delivery, and the sounds he heard from behind it were among the most frightening and most humbling things he had experienced. And when Maria opened the door and told him to come in, he crossed the threshold with the specific reverence of a man entering a space where something enormous had happened. Rosa was propped against the pillows, tired in a way that went all the way down, and she was holding the baby. The baby was red and unhappy-looking and extraordinarily small, and was making its displeasure with the world known in a thin, persistent voice that nonetheless sounded to Nathan like the most important sound he had ever heard. He sat on the edge of the bed, and Rosa turned slightly to show him the baby's face, and he looked at his son. "Hello," he said, which was all he had. "He looks like you," Rosa said, "around the forehead." Nathan looked up at her. She was watching him with the tired, clear eyes that he loved, and he was very sure in that moment that the 11 years he had spent on this land in this valley, working and building and being alone in ways he had mostly not admitted, had been the path to exactly this room, this moment, this woman looking at him over the head of their son. "What should we call him?" he asked. "James," she said, "for my father." "James Hudson," he said. He tried it in the air of the room. "James Charles Hudson." "For both of them." Rosa looked at him. Something moved across her face that was grief and gratitude together. "Yes," she said, "both of them." He reached out very carefully and touched his son's cheek with one finger. The baby turned toward the touch with the blind, instinctive trust of the newborn, and Nathan sat on the bed beside his wife with his finger held by the grip of his son's tiny hand, and he was, he thought, completely undone and entirely content. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, each one carrying forward what the last had laid down. James Hudson grew up on the ranch in the way that children grow up when they are raised by two people who are actively and demonstrably in love, with a deep security that has nothing to do with luxury, and everything to do with the specific warmth of a home where the adults laugh together and argue fairly and reach across tables for each other's hands. He was a bold, curious child with Rosa's intensity and Nathan's patience, which was a combination that worked out well for the horses, and the cattle and somewhat less well for the classroom at the Cimarron schoolhouse, where his teacher wrote in 1891 that James was the brightest student she had, which she included in the same letter in which she noted that he had spent the previous Tuesday attempting to determine whether the school's cistern could be converted to a small irrigation system. He could not. But the thinking behind the attempt was, the teacher acknowledged, not without merit. In the spring of 1887, Rosa had their second child, a daughter they named Consuela Maria Hudson, called Connie, who arrived in April with considerably less drama than her brother and regarded the world from the beginning with Nathan's gray-green eyes and Rosa's complete composure. She was 4 years old when she first climbed the fence of the bull's pen because she wanted to look at him more closely. And the bull, who was by this point getting along in years but remained magnificent, simply turned and looked at her with the weary dignity of an animal who has seen everything. Nathan found her there and lifted her over the fence with a combination of terror and laughter that was becoming characteristic of fatherhood. Rosa, watching from the yard, felt the love for him move through her the way it always did, warm and total, and without reservation. The Cimarron Valley changed in the years after 1885 as the railroad consolidated its presence in New Mexico territory, and the cattle market shifted, and new families arrived with new ideas about the land. Some of the changes were good. The railroad made it easier to move cattle to market without the grueling drives that had worn out men and livestock alike for 20 years. The new families brought skills and perspectives that enriched the community. The territorial politics began, slowly and imperfectly, to address some of the land grant injustices that had devastated so many families, though justice in the territorial legal system was inconsistent and often incomplete. Some changes were harder. Drought came in 1891 and stayed for 2 years, and Nathan and Rosa managed through it with careful planning and hard work and the accumulated knowledge of 8 years of working together. And they came out the other side with their herd reduced but intact, which was better than many of their neighbors. They helped where they could. When the Voss family, whose patriarch Harlan had lost his land in 1879, came through Cimarron in 1890 with nothing, Rosa organized a collection among the county's ranchers that got them started on a new piece of land in the Mora Valley. Nathan rode to Mora himself to help Harlan Voss repair the fence on his new property. Rosa sent Maria Santos with preserved food and practical supplies. It was the kind of help that neither of them discussed in terms of charity, because it was not charity. It was the acknowledgement that the line between stability and ruin in the New Mexico territory was thin and could be crossed by forces outside any individual's control, and that community was the only reliable buffer against it. Thomas Whitfield died in 1892, at 71 years old, in Santa Fe, having practiced law with integrity for 40 years, and managed to outlive 2 of the 3 members of the Santa Fe ring who had caused him the most professional grief. He left Rosa a letter that she read once and kept in the locked drawer with the first letter about Everett Crane, in the same drawer, because they were both documents of a life she had come through and they belonged together. Nathan found her sitting at her desk after she read the letter, and he did not ask. He simply brought her coffee and sat down across from her and waited, which was the thing she had always loved most about him, the way he understood when presence was more important than words. She told him about Thomas eventually, about what he had meant to her family and to her, the continuity he represented, the loyalty that had stretched across the ruin of one life and helped build another. Nathan listened in the way he always listened, with the full weight of his attention. "He would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," Nathan said. "He would have said you were too stubborn," she said. "He would have meant it as a compliment." Nathan almost smiled. High praise from a lawyer. She reached across the desk and took his hand. They sat like that for a while in the quiet of the afternoon, with the sound of James outside somewhere arguing spiritedly with Garrett about the merits of a particular fence post design, and Connie's lighter voice chiming in with observations that sounded, from the tone, like she was settling the dispute with the serene authority of a 6-year-old who has decided she is correct. In 1893, Rosa found herself expecting again, and the baby, born that November, was a boy they named Thomas after the lawyer and Nathan's grandfather, who had been a farmer in Ohio before the family moved west. Thomas Nathan Hudson arrived in the world with all the noise and urgency of someone who had important places to be, and he grew into a child who was in constant motion and genuinely interested in everything, which made him delightful company and an exhausting responsibility. 3 children and a successful ranch operation, and a partnership that had been tested by drought and economic shifts and the ordinary grinding difficulty of life in the territory. And Nathan and Rosa Hudson in 1895 were 2 people who had built something together that was, by any honest accounting, extraordinary. Not because it was dramatic, because it was real. They had arguments, real ones, about ranch management and money, and occasionally about nothing specific but really about the accumulated fatigue of a hard season. They had bad days and hard seasons, and the kind of losses that come with ranching and with life, an animal that died of a sickness that medicine could not address, a season where the prices were so low the margin nearly vanished. They got through these things the way people who genuinely love each other get through hard things, by being honest and refusing to make the difficulty bigger than it was by carrying it alone. And they had the other kind of days. The mornings when the valley was so beautiful that it asked for nothing except to be witnessed. The evenings on the porch with the children running in the yard, and the last light turning the red bluffs copper and rose. The dinners around the table that went long because someone had said something interesting, and nobody wanted to be the first to leave. The quiet nights that were not quiet at all but full of presence and warmth, and the specific ease of two people who have learned each other completely, and find the learning still ongoing. In the autumn of 1895, when James was 10 years old and already declaring his intention to run the biggest cattle operation in the territory by age 30, and Connie was 8 and had somehow acquired a comprehensive knowledge of horse bloodlines that made visiting buyers from other counties consult her, as though she were an established authority. And Thomas, at 2, was a force of nature, contained approximately 60% of the time in the yard by Garrett Cole's heroic vigilance. Nathan came home one evening from a trip into Cimarron with a particular expression on his face. Rosa recognized it. It was the expression he had worn at her gate in February of 1884, when he had come with preserved peaches and a bedroll, the one that said he had made a decision, and was committed to it, and slightly self-conscious about the commitment. He set down what he had brought, which turned out to be not peaches this time, but a bottle of good wine from the general store's new stock, which reflected 11 years of increasing civilization in Cimarron, and he looked at her across the kitchen. "Do you remember the day of the cattle sale?" he said. "I remember every detail," she said. He shook his head slowly. "I have thought about that day more times than I can count," he said. "About what would have happened if you had not been there, if I had bought that bull and driven home and never known your name. You would have had an adequate breeding season," she said. He laughed, which was one of her favorite sounds on earth. "I would have had a terrible breeding season," he said, "and I would have grown old being stubborn about it, which is a tragic conclusion." "A cautionary tale," she agreed. He came around the table and stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to see his face, and he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with everything he was, all of it, the boy who had inherited a failing ranch and built it into something real, the man who had stood in a cattle yard with dust on his boots and asked a stranger her name because the alternative was unthinkable. "I am very glad you outbid me," he said. "I know," she said. "I am very glad I asked your name. I know that too," she said. He leaned down and kissed her, and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back. And it was 11 years and 3 children, and a valley full of good grass, and a partnership built on honesty and respect, and the specific, transforming force of 2 stubborn people who had chosen each other with full awareness of what the choice entailed. Outside, James could be heard explaining to Garrett why a particular stretch of north fence needed immediate attention, and Connie had located Garrett's catalogs of horse breeds and was conducting a private audit, and Thomas had found something in the garden that interested him greatly, and was investigating it with a focus that suggested the kitchen garden was in some peril. Rosa and Nathan Hudson stood in their kitchen in the dusk of a New Mexico autumn in 1895, with their children's voices outside, and the wine on the table, and 12 years of a life built together stretching behind them, and an uncountable number of days ahead. And the valley was gold and red in the last light. And the roan bull's successor, a fine black and red cross that James had helped select at the Cimarron sale the previous spring with an authority that had made Nathan quietly proud, stood in the near pasture in the cooling air. The land that could not be taken sat solid and true under all of it. "Come and see the sunset," Rosa said. They walked out onto the porch together, and stood with the evening spreading its extraordinary colors across the sky above the bluffs, and Nathan's arm was around her shoulders, and her head was against his collarbone, and the valley held them both in the way that good land holds the people who have given themselves to it honestly, completely, without reservation. Thomas came running across the yard with something he had found in the garden and needed them to see urgently, and Connie followed to provide a more accurate scientific assessment of the discovery, and James came last with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who was too old to run, but had come anyway because everyone else was going. Nathan looked down at Rosa, and she looked up at him, and everything that had started on a dusty afternoon in a cattle yard in Cimarron, with a gavel crack and a woman who would not be outmaneuvered, and a man who could not let her leave without knowing her name, everything that had become of that moment stood around them in the golden light of a New Mexico evening, solid and full and entirely, perfectly real. The valley was quiet and the stars were coming out, and Rosa Boone Hudson was home.